The sand moves in waves like a slow-burning ocean. It is 1941. The temperature on the Libyan plateau climbs past 120 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. A German officer of the Afrika Korps crouches behind the burning hull of a Kubelwagen, his uniform soaked through, his lips cracked and bleeding. He reaches for the holster at his hip, the hard black shell of a German pistol, the most famous sidearm in the world. The Luger P08. He draws it, chambers around, points it at the approaching dust cloud where British Tommies are advancing through the haze. He pulls the trigger. Nothing. He racks the toggle, the beautiful, elegant, jointed lever that makes the Luger unlike any other pistol ever made. He feels a grain of desert sand catch in the mechanism. He tries again. The toggle locks. The gun is dead in his hand. In the western desert of North Africa, in one of the most brutal and unforgiving theaters of the Second World War, the most iconic pistol in German military history, the weapon that had fought through the trenches of the First World War, that had become the symbol of German martial power, had just failed. Not because of a manufacturing defect, not because of poor ammunition, but because of something the engineers at Deutsche Waffen und Munitionsfabriken had never truly planned for: a handful of fine, powdery, microscopic Saharan sand. This is the story of the Luger P08 in North Africa, a story of engineering brilliance that became battlefield catastrophe, a story of tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and how those thousandths of an inch cost lives in the desert. If you are new to this channel, welcome. We tell the real stories of the Second World War, the ones that don't always make the history books, the ones that happen when human ingenuity meets the chaos of combat. Hit that subscribe button and the bell so you don't miss a single one. To understand why the Luger failed in the desert, you have to understand what made it extraordinary, and why that same extraordinary quality was the source of its undoing. The pistol's full name was the Pistole Parabellum 1908. It was designed by Georg Luger, an Austrian arms designer working for Deutsche Waffen und Munitionsfabriken, DWM, in Germany. The design was patented in 1898, evolved through testing, and officially adopted by the German Army in 1908. That date, 1908, became its designation, the P08. From the moment it appeared, the Luger was unlike any other pistol in the world. While most semi-automatic pistols used a sliding action, a steel sleeve moving straight back and forward, the Luger used what engineers call a toggle lock mechanism. Picture a human knee joint. When you lock your knee straight, it can bear enormous downward force. When you bend it, it collapses under load. The Luger's toggle worked on the same principle. When the pistol fired, the recoil drove the barrel and toggle assembly rearward. The toggle, that distinctive jointed arm on top of the pistol, would break upward at its joint, ejecting the spent cartridge case, compressing the recoil spring, then snap back forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. It was mechanical genius. It gave the Luger an extraordinarily low-bore axis, meaning the barrel sat very low in the hand, which in turn gave the pistol a natural pointing geometry that shooters loved. When you raised a Luger and pointed it, it felt like an extension of your arm. The ergonomic grip angle, set at precisely 55 degrees, was so well calculated that the American Ruger Pistol Company would later base their own designs on it. The Luger was also accurate, beautifully, consistently accurate. German armorers hand-fitted each pistol's components to tolerances that most factories could barely imagine. The side plate, the toggle links, the breech block, every moving part was individually fitted to its specific pistol. You could not take the side plate from one Luger and place it on another, and expect the pistol to work correctly. The parts were matched at the factory to thousandths of an inch. That level of precision was its greatest strength, and in the deserts of North Africa, it became its fatal weakness. The Luger was also the gun that invented its own ammunition. The 9mm Parabellum cartridge, the round that today is the most widely used pistol cartridge on the planet, chambered in everything from military service pistols to police sidearms to civilian self-defense handguns, was specifically designed by Georg Luger for his pistol. The name parabellum comes from the ancient Latin phrase, si vis pacem, parabellum. If you wish for peace, prepare for war. It was a fitting name for a round that would go on to be fired in virtually every conflict of the 20th century. The North African campaign began in earnest when Mussolini declared war on June 10, 1940. Italy's forces in Libya immediately threatened British-held Egypt and the Suez Canal, the vital artery through which Britain supplied its empire. The opening Italian offensive stumbled, and by February 1941, British and Commonwealth forces had destroyed the Italian 10th Army and captured over 130,000 prisoners. Then Hitler intervened. On February 12, 1941, a German general named Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli, Libya. He had earned his reputation commanding the 7th Panzer Division during the fall of France in 1940, where his aggressive speed had bewildered Allied commanders. The Germans sent him to North Africa with a small force initially called a blocking detachment, just enough to prop up the collapsing Italian position. Hitler's intent was limited: stabilize the front, hold what remained. Rommel had entirely different ideas. By late March 1941, Rommel was attacking. Within 2 weeks, his columns had covered over 600 miles of desert. The British were reeling. Tobruk was surrounded. By April 1941, German and Italian forces had pushed all the way to the Egyptian border. Rommel's speed, daring, and tactical ingenuity earned him a nickname that would outlast the war itself: Der Wüstenfuchs, the Desert Fox. But the desert cared nothing for nicknames. The Saharan environment that the Afrika Korps now operated in was unlike anything German soldiers had trained for or expected. Temperatures swung from 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day to near freezing at night. The air was bone dry. Winds arrived without warning, filling the atmosphere with a fine, powdery sand that was unlike any sand soldiers had encountered in Europe. This wasn't beach sand. Rough, granular, easy to brush away. Saharan sand was microscopic. It hung in the air for hours after a windstorm. It penetrated every seam, every joint, every gap in metal, every fold of fabric. Soldiers ate it, they breathed it. It ground into their eyes, their skin, their equipment. The National Army Museum in London records that rough terrain and constant sand abrasion caused vehicles to break down at alarming rates. Engines failed. Gun mechanisms jammed. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of desert. Lines that were attacked constantly by the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy over the Mediterranean. Everything that could break did break, including the most famous pistol in the German arsenal. Here is the engineering truth that destroyed the Luger in the desert. And it begins with a concept that most people outside the manufacturing world have never heard of: precision tolerance. When engineers design a machine, any machine, they specify how much variation is acceptable in each dimension of each part. A shaft might be designed to fit inside a cylinder. The shaft must be slightly smaller than the cylinder, otherwise it won't fit. But if the gap between them is too large, the shaft will wobble, create friction in the wrong places, and the machine will function poorly. Engineers express this acceptable range of variation as a tolerance. They might specify that a shaft must be a certain diameter, plus or minus 5/1000ths of an inch. That 5/1000ths of an inch is the tolerance. Tight tolerances mean high precision. The parts fit together with almost no gap. The mechanism is smooth, accurate, consistent. Loose tolerances mean more variation is acceptable. The parts don't fit quite as precisely, but they can be manufactured faster and cheaper, and critically, they are more forgiving of contamination. A little grit in a loosely toleranced mechanism might not cause problems. A little grit in a tightly toleranced mechanism can stop it dead. The Luger P08 was manufactured to some of the tightest tolerances in the pistol world of its era. This was by design. It was what gave the gun its legendary accuracy and smooth action. The toggle links, the breech block, the receiver, all fitted with extraordinary precision. American tests conducted before the First World War, when the United States Army was evaluating the Luger as a possible service pistol, found that even small amounts of contamination caused the pistol to jam. The Army ultimately passed on the Luger. In the clean, well-lubricated conditions of a target range, the Luger was superb, but the toggle lock mechanism had another vulnerability beyond simply tight tolerances. Unlike a conventional slide-action pistol, where the mechanism is largely enclosed, the Luger's toggle assembly was exposed on the top of the pistol. When the toggle broke upward during the firing cycle, it opened a gap directly into the mechanism. In a desert environment, that gap was an invitation. Every shot, every cycle of the action. Sand could enter. The Luger also required lubrication to function correctly. Oil on the moving parts reduced friction and allowed the toggle mechanism to cycle smoothly. In a desert environment, that oil had another property. It attracted and held the fine Saharan dust. Sand that might otherwise pass through a dry mechanism was instead captured, held, and packed into the tight spaces between moving parts. Over rounds fired and hours of exposure, a well-oiled Luger became a sand trap. The mechanism grew sluggish. The toggle struggled to complete its cycle. Rounds failed to chamber. Cartridge cases failed to eject. The gun that had been designed as a masterpiece of precision engineering was being destroyed by its own precision. British and American soldiers who captured Lugers as war trophies, and many did, the Luger being one of the most prized souvenirs of the war, quickly learned that the pistol required constant maintenance. American Rifleman magazine, in describing the Luger, quoted experts who noted that the gun was built to such tight tolerances that it was susceptible to problems in the trenches and in general service. Firearms historian Garry James, consulted by American Rifleman Television, described the Luger as a little cranky and especially ammunition sensitive. In the desert, cranky became catastrophic. The Germans were not unaware of these problems. In fact, the process of replacing the Luger had begun more than a decade before the Afrika Korps set foot in Libya. As early as 1927, the German military establishment began looking for a replacement for the Luger P08. The problems were well understood. The pistol was expensive to manufacture, requiring skilled armorers and hand-fitting of parts. It was time-consuming to produce, and its sensitivity to dirt and contamination made it a liability in field conditions. When Adolf Hitler began the massive rearmament of Germany in 1935, equipping the expanding Wehrmacht with Lugers was cost-prohibitive. Germany needed millions of pistols. The Luger could not be produced at that scale, at that speed, at an acceptable price. The Carl Walther Company had been developing an alternative since 1932. After 6 years of prototypes and testing, the result was adopted by the Wehrmacht in 1938, the Walther P38. The P38 was a fundamentally different design philosophy. Where the Luger used its elegant toggle lock, the P38 used a more conventional locked breech action. Where the Luger required hand-fitting of matched parts, the P38 was designed for mass production. Its components could be manufactured by workers with less training to less exacting specifications, interchangeable between pistols. Where the Luger was a jewel of precision engineering, the P38 was a rugged tool of war. It was not as aesthetically beautiful as the Luger. It was not as ergonomically perfect. But it worked in the mud. It worked in the cold of the Eastern Front. And, critically for the Afrika Korps, it was more tolerant of sand and dust than the pistol it replaced. The plan was for the P38 to completely replace the Luger. But war has its own timeline. Production lines take time to convert. The Wehrmacht was expanding faster than the factories could equip it. And so, through the early years of the war, the Luger P08 remained in service, produced by Mauser at its factory in Oberndorf, supplemented by a Luftwaffe contract with Heinrich Krieghoff and Son. German officers carried it. NCOs carried it. It fought in France, in the Balkans, in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. And it went to North Africa with the Afrika Korps. Mauser produced Lugers until December 1943. The German army took its last delivery of Mauser-made Lugers in November 1943, 1,000 pistols. A final batch of 4,000 assembled in December of that year was refused by the military entirely and sold to Portugal. The German army had simply stopped accepting them. By then, the P38 had taken over as the primary German service pistol. But for 2.5 years in the North African desert, German officers had gone into battle with a pistol that the desert was slowly but systematically defeating. Numbers and engineering tell part of this story, but wars are fought by human beings, and it is in the human stories that the truth lives most vividly. Consider what it meant for a German officer in the Libyan desert to draw his Luger and have it fail. Pistols in the Second World War were not the primary weapons of combat. That role belonged to rifles, machine guns, artillery, and tanks. But pistols existed for a reason. They were the last resort. The weapon an officer drew when everything else had failed, when enemy soldiers had broken through the line, when the tank had been knocked out and the crew was fighting for their lives in the sand, when the desperate, close-range chaos of war had reduced everything to the most basic equation: my weapon or yours. In those moments, the moments that mattered most, the Luger's elegance became irrelevant. What mattered was reliability, and reliability was exactly what the desert was stripping away. German soldiers adapted, as soldiers always do. They developed maintenance routines specific to the desert environment, cleaning the pistol more frequently, reducing the amount of oil on the mechanism, understanding that excess lubrication was a liability in fine sand. Carrying the pistol in its special hard-shell holster, a design feature of the Luger's leather case that was specifically intended to protect the mechanism from contamination, and keeping it closed except when needed. Some officers preferred to carry the more reliable P38 when they could obtain one, or to rely on captured British Enfield revolvers, which were simpler in design and significantly more tolerant of desert conditions. A revolver, it turned out, was a better desert sidearm than the most famous pistol in the German military. The irony was not lost on the men who lived it. There is something worth pausing on here. The Afrika Korps faced supply challenges that went far beyond small arms. The unit operated at the end of one of the most precarious supply lines in the war. Everything from tank ammunition to drinking water to pistol cleaning equipment had to travel by ship across the Mediterranean, increasingly dominated by the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. Allied convoys were attacked. German and Italian shipping was sunk. At the critical moment of the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, when Rommel made his last bid to break through to Egypt, the Afrika Korps had just 35 tanks operational and was running dangerously short on fuel and ammunition. In that context, the question of whether a pistol was reliable might seem trivial. But it illustrates something profound about the nature of the Desert War, and indeed about warfare itself. Every system, from a 60-ton Panzer IV tank to a 30-ounce pistol, was under relentless pressure from the environment. Every failure compounded every other failure. The desert did not distinguish between the magnificent and the mundane. It tested everything equally, and precision in the desert was a double-edged sword. The North African campaign ended in May 1943 when the remnants of the German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered to Allied armies. Over 275,000 Axis soldiers went into captivity. The Afrika Korps, whose last signal from its final commander, General Hans Kramer, read, "Ammunition shot off. Arms and equipment destroyed. In accordance with order received, Afrika Korps has fought itself to the condition where it can fight no more. The German Afrika Korps must rise again." Ceased to exist. The Luger P08 continued in service until the end of the war, but its role had been substantially diminished. Production ended, the Wehrmacht refused new deliveries, and the Walther P38 had become the standard German service pistol. After the war, the P38 was adopted by the new West German Bundeswehr and served German police and military forces for decades. The Luger entered the world of collectors and museums. Today, original Luger P08 pistols in good condition command prices in the thousands of dollars at auction. They are beautiful objects, arguably the most aesthetically striking military pistol of the 20th century. Collectors prize them. Museums display them. Film directors choose them for any scene requiring a German villain to produce a weapon of menace and elegance. But the engineers know the truth, and the soldiers of the Afrika Korps learned it in the hardest possible classroom. The Luger P08 was a masterpiece, designed in an age when best meant most precise. It was a product of the 19th century Swiss watchmaking tradition, applied to a weapon of war. And in the controlled conditions for which it was designed, it was everything its creators promised. But the desert does not care about precision. The desert cares about survival. And survival in combat belongs not to the most elegant solution, but to the most robust one. There is a lesson here that extends far beyond the mechanism of a German pistol. It is a lesson about the difference between optimized performance and resilient performance, between a system that functions perfectly under ideal conditions and one that functions adequately under any conditions. Engineers call this the distinction between efficiency and robustness. Military planners call it the difference between a weapon that works at the range and a weapon that works in the field. The armies that won the Second World War understood this distinction. The American M1 Garand, the Soviet Mosin Nagant rifle, the British Esten submachine gun. These were not the most precise or elegant weapons of the war, but they worked. They worked in mud and in ice and in jungle humidity and in desert sand. They were built to loose enough tolerances that a grain of grit would not stop them. Their designers understood that the perfect was the enemy of the good, and that in war the enemy of good is disaster. The Luger P08 stands today as one of the most iconic firearms in history, and it deserves that status. It was a revolutionary design. It introduced the most widely used pistol cartridge in the world. It was, in the hands of a careful soldier in favorable conditions, a superb weapon. But in the sands of Libya and Egypt from 1941 to 1943, it met an adversary it was never designed to defeat. Not a British Tommy, not a Sherman tank, not Field Marshal Montgomery. A grain of sand, microscopic, invisible, patient as eternity, and far more lethal to German precision engineering than any bullet ever fired in the Western Desert. The desert, in the end, does not negotiate with perfection. It only tests it. If this story made you think about the hidden forces that shape the outcome of battles, the engineering decisions made in peacetime that cost lives in wartime, then this channel has dozens more stories waiting for you. Subscribe, hit the like button, and activate the bell. Every week we dig beneath the headlines of history to find the real stories, the ones that matter. We'll see you in the next one.